It seemed to me that the issue about Cavanaugh's believability, whether or not we should give him the benefit of the doubt or not, could have been resolved if the FBI had been allowed to do a real, thorough investigation, which the Senate, the President, did not allow. And so it could have been resolved, but the administration didn't allow it to happen. So I'd like to hear your comments about that, your thoughts about that.
I think that opinion on that issue is very divided as well, because a lot has to do with whether you buy into the idea that these allegations, as it were, were raised at the very last minute as an obstacle to the process, partly so that the midterm elections could happen and sort of the change, could overtake the nomination or not, and so it's really hard to say that. On the other hand, I think it is entirely legitimate to make sure that people who go up through the court are vetted as closely as possible. And I think that in hindsight, I do think that the Senate should give some thoughts about formalizing its process a little bit more. So for example, there was a controversy about whether Dr. Ford was actually invited to testify in private, and if so, whether she would have only testified before staffers, in California, or whether she could come to Washington and do it. I think that, maybe the Senate should develop a standard, and it should develop a way to respond to these kinds of accusations. One has to be worried that if something isn't done, I think most people would tend to agree that the process itself was rather grotesque. I mean, if you wanted to design a process for truth finding, you could not have done worse than what was done. And so I think for example, perhaps the standard should be formalized. Perhaps too, there should be some period for public comment. I'm a teacher of administrative law, and administrative agencies believe in public comment. Open up the record. Let's hear from everybody. And then at some point, the record needs to be closed. At some point, we've heard enough. And if there were some process whereby after a certain date, allegations that came after that simply wouldn't be considered, we wouldn't have the rushed nature of the process. And I think a lot of the dysfunction arose from the very hurried nature of the process. That to some extent was unavoidable in hindsight, but with the benefit of hindsight, can't we get better next time?
I think his opening statement that the Democrats were in charge of all of these people coming forward, and especially the Clintons, that was a real term.
Was
a conspiracy theory that the Democrats were in charge of these women coming forward.
And it's a shame that this ends up, being. It's a shame that the real battlegrounds became so partisan. I think, again, most people would agree with that. Ideally, the basic objective of all people of good faith would think be to get to the bottom of the accusations and have a full process where, everyone feels at the end of the process like at least as much was done as was reasonably possible, and people feel like they've got as much evidence as reasonably can be obtained. But it very quickly became partisan. And, I don't think that, I think that has a lot to do with, the nature of the country and the nature of the parties right now.
You mentioned the unsettled nature from, 1824 until the advent of the Civil War, about 30 nominees and only 16 appointments. I think about these unsettled times. Today I had reason to participate in the Environmental Protection Agency survey and asking about, the toxins release website and rulemaking and things like that. And it occurs to me that my confidence in the agency is undermined by some of the disruption of, the withdrawal of certain regulatory oversight, the lack of filling all the staff positions that have been held by credible scientists for so many years. When I look at the U.S. Supreme Court and I witness Judge Cavanaugh's testimony, that I thought the decorum was lost, the sense of dignity that I have attributed to Supreme Court justices, whether I agree with their political position, their judicial decisions or not. This idea that we ought to have respectability among these people in such powerful positions. What are your comments about that? I'm worried if I lose confidence, if I and others lose confidence in these significant anchors to our democracy, then we will have lost so much more than just whether somebody is appointed to the Supreme Court or not. How do you respond to that? What can we as citizens do to retain confidence in our government?
I think that's a really difficult question because, you know, so in other words, I'm going to try to duck it. I think that particularly for judges, you do hope that they bring a certain gravitas and objectivity to the process. And, you know, and there were indeed many people, indeed, a letter signed by, I believe, almost 2,000 law professors was actually sent to the Senate, complaining precisely about the lack of judicial temperament represented during Justice Cavanaugh's confirmation hearing. I didn't subscribe to that letter, and I disagree with it, largely because I think that the tenor of his tone was essentially dictated by two things. One was the Democrats' charge of him as evil from the very beginning of the process, including senators who said that they would do anything they could to keep him from being appointed. Secondly, the nature of the president who was selecting him. I think that in many ways he felt himself and was advised to take a very aggressive stance, fighting fire with fire. And the third thing is that having been familiar with him as a person and with his, 18 years of judicial opinions for the D.C. Circuit, I have to ask myself, how would I feel if people who falsely accused me in front of my family of misconduct that I know I did not do? I'd be mad. I'd be really mad. I'd have trouble controlling my temper. He had trouble controlling his temper. I can't blame him for that. So that's kind of where I come out of it. I think that there's a little bit of hypocrisy involved too. If you follow the media's characterization of his interview on television, they characterized him as robotic. He was being criticized for robotic. So, you know, I had this feeling that had he come across at the confirmation proceeding as unruffled and unmeddled by all of these accusations, then he would have been criticized for showing no feeling, showing no emotion. Where's his heart? Maybe I'm cynical about it. I am cynical about the process. I think that at that stage he would have been criticized for whatever he did. I think that, let me say something else too. Brett Kavanaugh is very much a person in the image of John Roberts, who I also work with. They don't do anything by chance. I think that, this is my opinion, I think Brett Kavanaugh decided there is only one way for me to win this. I'm going to come out and take the offensive. And I know I'm going to irritate a whole lot of people, but I'm going to solidify the base. And I think in the end, it was probably, it was one of several factors that caused the senators to vote him in by the narrowest of margins. So in hindsight, I think at one level it's a human, it's a human issue of being personally attacked. And on the other level, I think it was an extremely wise strategic move, to be quite honest with you. So that's my 2 cents.
So I apologize if you have alluded to my question already. I don't hear too well, but it has been circulated among the press and certainly among some people in the law community that to change the lifetime appointment of Supreme Court justices, rather than being lifetime, maybe to something like 18 years, which would be the equivalent of 3 terms for a senator. My question, I guess, is the lifetime appointment cast in stone? And if the community at large would like to change that, would it require the big constitutional change of others.
It would, because under Article 3, justices hold their offices during good behavior. So there are a lot of difficult questions about what good behavior means. In practice, it's meant for federal judges, if you avoid being convicted of a felony, you have a job for life. But I don't think that the Constitution would permit the imposition of a term limit, precisely because of that term, during good behavior. Now, there's some really significant other similar issues arising of whether a sitting judge, including a justice, can be impeached based on conduct that predated his appointment. Again, it's very interesting to read the competing publications in the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal. The editorial writers in the Journal took the position, which I'm sure the conservatives will, that during good behavior means that you can only be removed for conduct that occurs while you were sitting as a judge. So any conduct predating it is not a grounds for impeachment. That to me is far less clear, but because there is a disconnect between the provisions governing the impeachment of officers of the United States and Article 3's provision about judges involved enjoying their position, their office during good behavior. Impeachment can occur based on high crimes and misdemeanors. That includes justices as well as presidents. And it's not at all clear to me that some kind of high crime and misdemeanor that predated a person's taking office couldn't be the grounds for impeaching that person. I would have to think the answer is yes. If you discovered a sitting president who committed a murder, would you say, oh, well, that was before he took office, or she took office, we can't do the impeachment? I find that pretty unlikely. But I'm sure it's one of the issues that will arise. Yes?
Chief Justice John Roberts has asked for an ethics investigation of Brett Kavanaugh. At this point, what good would that do, and what would be the expected outcome, even if he was found guilty of all these accusations? What would happen?
I don't know what could happen. Again, it is conceivable. I don't know much about the details of the ethics investigation. It's actually news to me. But the only way to remove a justice is through the impeachment process, where accusations are voted on by the House, and then the actual trial on the charges brought by the House or in the Senate. And I don't know whether Chief Justice Roberts would have to recuse himself if he's the one who called for the investigation in the first place from a trial of the impeachment. There is a body of judges who serve as the disciplinary body for lower federal court judges, who, for example, get involved in various forms of misconduct that don't amount to impeachable misconduct. But I don't believe that the justices are subject to any of that discipline that lower federal judges are susceptible to. So the answer is I don't know. Ron, you calling on the ethics expert here. Sir.
So I noticed the constitutional provisions about putting in justices only says the Senate on the advice and consent of the Senate. How much does the advice portion of that actually play in? Because I saw it floated elsewhere and even had the idea, because our senator here is very conservative. Can the senators advise the president to nominate somebody else who maybe doesn't have the baggage but maybe has a similar viewpoint? If so, how much does the Constitution's advice play into that?
It's another great question. I really appreciate hearing so many questions I don't know the answer to. But with respect to that one, the senators actually play a major role when it comes to suggesting lower federal court judges. There's this process called the blue slip process, whereby largely senators have a leading role in suggesting to the president appointees for the federal courts of appeals and the federal district courts. As a matter of practice, senators have not had a major role in nominating or suggesting, recommending U.S. Supreme Court nominees. But that's just a matter of practice that's developed, and I guess the theory is that, well, you know, the justices are supposed to represent the entire nation, whereas the lower federal courts tend to have fairly defined geographic boundaries. And in theory, you know, sort of are thought to represent in part more limited geographic areas than the entire country. But I don't know, from the little reading I've done, again, not only has the Senate had a little role, presidents don't ask them for vice presidents very widely in terms of how they go about selecting their nominees. And, you know, I know, like you, I suppose, and many other folks in the audience, all I know is what I read in the media. You know, apparently some of the more recent Republican presidents have largely eschewed reliance on the ABA, although the Republicans are in the odd situation now of first saying, well, the ABA is the gold standard, and they gave Justice Kavanaugh, you know, the highest well-qualified rating. But then the ABA has now kind of put that on hold and is doing a reinvestigation. So now the Republicans are forced to say, well, maybe not so much after all. And then there's this guy, you know, who's the head of the Federalist Society, somebody, Leo, who apparently has a major role in kind of filling President Trump's ear. Whatever's going on, it sure seems like the Senate is largely left out of it. I don't see President Trump as someone who relies on people in the Senate or anywhere in Congress very much, which he does.
Anyone else?
Thanks very much for
Thank
your
you very much.
contribution.